So, as Letty mentioned, my name is Joanna Mountain, and my core research over the last number of years, I can't even remember how many, has been to look at the genetic diversity of peoples of Africa in order to better understand the history of population migrations and isolation on that continent. And I'll step back initially just to give you an overview for how geneticists see human history. And one thing that disturbs some people about geneticists is that we are very simplifying. And any historian would balk at this something so crude. But this is the general pattern that is revealed by genetic data for a number of genetic systems. And that pattern suggests that about, we had a little bit of a, it looks like it may be thinking it's timing itself. Maybe moving automatically. I better speed up. Oh. I'm going to have to make sure that there's no timing. Oh, yeah. Under slideshow.
Very bottom.
Got it? Okay. So, the genetic data suggests that our species was in Africa about 100,000 years ago, and certainly earlier. But that's an interesting point of time. Modern humans are starting to look a bit like our modern form, more gracile. And at that point, somewhere within the last 50 to, let's say, 70,000 years, our ancestors started moving out of Africa and probably remained on a southern route, eventually getting out to New Guinea and Australia, certainly by 40,000 years, maybe even a bit earlier. Subsequently, moving north into, further north in Asia, a bit more recently getting out into Western Europe, and then subsequently coming to the Americas. The dates here range from 15,000 years to 35,000 years. There's a lot of debate about when our ancestors, when humans first reached the Americas, but it's relatively recent compared to the rest of the world. Okay, but my interest is in Africa. And when we look at this diagram here, there's not a lot of detail. There's sort of an indication of one movement there, one movement there, and that's what the standard, the sort of the general overview is about Africa. And my goal has been for the last few years to go beyond that and just get a little bit more detail for this understudied part of the world. And one of the reasons that this is of interest is that we like to look at other dimensions of human diversity in the context of human migrations. And Africa is particularly rich in terms of linguistic diversity. There are 4 major language families on the continent. And here, the Eurasiatic language family covers much of Eurasia. There certainly are a number of language families outside of Africa. And you'll note that this is looking back into the past. This is not thinking about language families and their presence today. This is thinking about, let's say, 500 years ago, before much of the recent migration. But there's a great deal of linguistic diversity within Africa. And one of the questions I've been grappling with is, how isolated have human populations been, particularly in Africa? It's a question you can ask about any part of the world. And going along with that question is this one. When we look at human linguistic, cultural, behavioral diversity, did that arise because populations were not in contact with one another, or despite the fact that populations have been in contact over thousands of years? So there's a framework. We're interested in the migration patterns themselves and the isolation, but we're interested in part because we want to compare the genetic diversity to other dimensions of human diversity. So it's I think, worth taking a look at the landscape where our ancestors were evolving or living, and this is a bit more stereotypical in terms of a savanna area, and certainly much of Africa currently is savanna, covered by savanna, but there are radically different environments in Africa. You have penguins. These were pictures taken by my students in the fall when they were in South Africa. This almost looks like the Californian coast. You have desert areas. These are the red dunes of the Kalahari, where I was about a year and a half ago in northern South Africa, western Botswana. That's an amazing place. It's amazing. The sand preserves the tracks of the animals, so that it makes tracking animals much easier. You have expert trackers there. You have mountainous regions such as the Drakensbergs in southern Africa. And we know that there were, just 1,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers living in all these parts of southern Africa and sub-Saharan Africa in general. This is a picture from Tanzania where we have a lake region and near the Ngorongoro crater. So we've got a lot of ecological diversity. And so just to take us beyond the stereotypical view of Africa as a savanna, you have the Delta region in Botswana where people live on the water. They're using boats to get from home to anywhere they go. Really amazing diversity in the terrain in which people live. So there's not only diversity in space, but there has been a great deal of diversity through time. And when Africa, you may not think about Africa being as affected by the glacial cycle as let's say, Northern Europe, but it has been greatly influenced by this cycle. During periods of deglaciation, you have warmer, wetter Africa. The forested region is more extensive. The savanna region, fairly hospitable to our ancestors, is very broad. That things weren't always so wonderful. There are periods, a dry period, where the forest shrinks, and locations where there's savanna are very small and subdivided or isolated from one another during the cooler and drier periods. So, and during the period from about 25,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, though there are debates on exact, time span, this area, especially down in the southern half of Africa, was very dry, and there are fewer human remains there available there from them. So one of my questions is, during those dry periods, what did people do? Did they converge on multiple refugia? Did a few people find hospitable pockets to live in eastern Africa, a few in southern, and a few maybe in the forests? Or, in which case, our history looks something like this, where we have isolated populations. We know there's been recent exchange between the groups, but this is a sort of a history of, a possible history of African populations, indicating a great deal of isolation because there are no arrows until the recent time. So that's one possibility. An alternative is that during these dry periods, basically people went extinct in these regions, or everyone moves back into the more hospitable area of eastern Africa. We do know from archaeological fossil evidence that there was persistence of our species in eastern Africa throughout this entire period, the last 100,000 years, and certainly way back earlier. And so eastern Africa has been very important in human history. But was it the only region that was able to support human populations? In which case, our history is something like this, where we would have a large population 25,000 years ago. It might have shrunk, and then maybe we have a little bit more divergence in recent times as people move out. But this is a radically different summary of history in Africa. Now, I haven't put on here the possible populations going extinct, but that's part of that story there. And I have focused, this is another map of the languages spoken, language families spoken in Africa. And I have focused on peoples who speak the Khoisan or Khoisan, Click languages of both Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. You don't even see any of the pink color up here because there are very few speakers, but there are a couple of isolated populations in Tanzania who speak Khoisan languages. And those languages include, the words include this click consonant. This is one, there are a number of different ways of making the click sound depending on where you put the tongue. We actually can make a lot of clicking sounds. Now, it's where most of us can make clicking sounds. We've had to do it in, doing tut-tut noises and so on. But incorporating them into as a consonant into words, even multiple clicks in a word, is very unusual outside of Africa. In fact, it's almost non-existent. There's one exception. So these are fascinating languages, and but the history of the speakers of these languages is very poorly understood. I'm getting a little better at using clicks, but I'm not an expert by any means. I do work with a couple of linguists who concentrate on these languages. And what I did, linguists do refuse to summarize what they think are the relationships amongst the click languages. So what I've done is do my best, and of course I get stones thrown at me by all the linguists because they don't like part of my summary. But it's, we need to think about language, and I have to summarize what I understand to be the situation. So what I have here are a number of click languages. So there are a lot of click languages. And I've given suggested relationships. Now we're seeing here two languages that don't seem to be connected to any of the others, so there's a possible connection between this one and here. These are the Tanzanian click languages, Hadza and Sandawe. Some linguists lump them all together into one language family. Others will only say that there are 10 different language families. There's a lot of debate in the linguistics community. We have genetic samples from all of the groups listed here. So that's where we're trying to figure out the relationships, the level exchange between the groups, and then we'll look at the linguistics on that background. So in Tanzania, there's a lake called Lake Eyasi right here near the Ngorongoro crater. This is Mount Kilimanjaro right there. And some of these click speakers live right around the lake, the Hadza. The Sandawe are further south, but they're not very far apart. And so that's something curious, because the linguists don't think their languages are very related. Even though they live close to one another, they share the click component of their languages. So I've worked with the Hadza, and these are just some photographs from my trip a few years ago. A fascinating group. They've been studied extensively by anthropologists, and still live via hunting and gathering, though lately it's more through tourism, by dressing up in indigenous clothing and so on. So their lives are changing very rapidly. The Sandawe are a neighboring population. They are currently agriculturalists, so they have moved on from hunting and gathering and are somewhat more integrated into the rest of the more broad community in Tanzania. But they speak click languages as well. So I am focusing on various parts of our genome, including the autosomes, mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome, and X chromosome. Anybody who thinks about chromosomes, and I know there are some people in the biology department who do, won't be very comfortable with this, but this is just an attempt to show, for some audiences, we need to think about, show them that we have these pairs of chromosomes. The X and the Y are here. I'll talk only about the Y chromosome today, or a little bit about the purple autosomes. The mitochondrial DNA found out in the mitochondria outside the nucleus, very informative. But the Y chromosome is even more informative, so that's what I'll talk about, I'll concentrate on today. So the Y chromosome, this is the summary of the Y chromosome put forth by the Genographic Project. And this is basically a family tree for paternal ancestry. So all the males in here, and for all women, I take my father as, the channel for the Y chromosome or the paternal line. Everybody fits somewhere in this male family tree, and it's fascinating in that many of these lineages are found only in some certain parts of the world. There's a lot of structuring of this family tree, remarkably. And that's shown a little bit here where we have that same family tree, and we give these clusters of lineages labels so that all the A's are more similar to one another than they are to the B's, and so on. Now when we look within Africa, we see predominantly the A, B, and E clusters of Y chromosomes. So that's the green, red, and blue. But even within Africa, there are parts of Africa where you don't see the red and the blue, and parts where you see a lot of red and blue. So these are very important lineages for us. And those lineages are defined typically by a single nucleotide polymorphism, or a SNP. That is a single base change in the DNA sequence. So we focus on those. And there are a couple of SNPs that I will mention or discuss. One is defined by a mutation called M112, another by a mutation called M2, and these were mutations that were discovered by the laboratory of Luca Cavalli-Sforza at Stanford. They turned out to be very informative because they are found in the Khoisan-speaking populations, as well as in speakers of other language families as well. So no need to pay much attention to the details here, except to notice that the M2 mutation is, you have numbers almost for every population here, for most of them. And the high numbers are here for the Niger-Portophanian speakers, and that will be relevant later on. We look at another type of mutation called microsatellite, or STR, and an example is shown here where you have what we call flanking sequence in yellow, and in between that sequence we have something repeated. Here we have CA, 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 and in one case you have, I think, that looks like 7 copies, and here we have 9 copies. Any given male will have either this or some other variant with different numbers of copies. These are rapidly mutating genetic systems. They can be very informative. Eric was mentioning yesterday that for his species, these are the only kind of markers that are variable enough to give insights. They're very valuable for human studies. So they're another way we can look at variation. These are data. Just so you know, we actually do have data, and this is what those data look like for the Y chromosome. These are individuals here from Tanzania, and then for each STR polymorphism, we give the number of repeat copies, and you see it varies. Here we have 15 for many people, but a few have 17, one has 18. And the way these things mutate, they typically, you go from 15 to 16 or 15 to 14 repeats. It's something that, at least that's how we model it and how we hope it works. At the end, we have those mutations that define the clusters of lineages. And we then take those lineages and we look within any given SNP family. So this is the B2B or M112. This is one set of lineages, and we ask, well, what is the STR variation on that background? So for people who are not used to looking at networks, it takes a little while to figure out what we're showing here. But basically, each of these nodes represents a number of individuals who have an identical haplotype or set of numbers for their STR, markers. And then the branches indicate how many mutations separate those sequences or haplotypes. So we have here, this is green, that refers to an individual who is identified as a Biaka pygmy from Central Africa, but quite differentiated from these individuals who are Southern African click speakers. The blues are all Eastern African click speakers, so the dark blue are the Hadza and the light blue are the Sandawe click speakers. And what is interesting about this particular haplogroup or set of lineages is that most populations who harbor this mutation are currently hunting and gathering, or were doing so relatively recently. So this seems to be a lineage that goes back very deeply within hunting and gathering peoples in Africa. We then turn to another, this is the M2 network, and that was, M2 was the lineage that was found in many populations in Africa. And you may, this looks a lot like the previous picture, and it's got nodes and connections, but you will notice here that many of the circles have multiple colors. Multiple colors means that there are multiple populations represented by the same sequence. Okay, that means sharing of genetic types across populations. And it doesn't take much to guess that that means there's been exchange between populations. So why do we have some lineages that seem to be moving about and other lineages that don't seem to be moving across populations? Well, it turns out that this particular set of lineages is very high frequency in a group of populations that speak Bantu languages. The Bantu languages arose in Western Africa, and the speakers of Bantu languages actually have moved in large numbers across to Eastern Africa, down to Southern Africa, and had a very large genetic impact on almost every population in Africa. They've taken their language and they've taken their genes. Many populations now speak Bantu languages. So what we're seeing here is the gene flow, and what has happened is that the lineages coming from the Bantu speakers have moved into the hunter-gatherer populations, but the reverse has not happened nearly as much. You have far less flow of males from the hunting-gathering groups into the agriculturalist groups. And so that's actually what we're seeing. And this is the same diagram we saw before for the M112, and I'm not seeing the labels right here, but this is the M112, and it's much larger. There are many more mutations on this background. It's a much older lineage, and reflects the time depth of hunting-gathering peoples in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the M2 lineage that's found in high frequency in Bantu speakers. It's small, there are a few mutations here. These are at scale with respect to one another. And this is a young haplogroup that has moved relatively recently into Eastern Africa. And we're seeing that signal of a migration of Bantu speakers right there in the Y chromosome. And so I consider these to be layers of human history, where this is the deeper layer showing the ancient structure of the peoples of much of sub-Saharan Africa, but basically we're just looking at a few populations. And this is the recent layer where we see a lot of sharing of haplotypes as people have moved into, from the West Africa Bantu-speaking area into other parts of Africa. And that's shown here in just a rough summary of the migration, the hypothesized migration of Bantu speakers from Western Africa over, across the Lake Victoria into the area of Tanzania right here, and then coming south all the way down to the southern tip eventually. So one of my goals is to go behind, to try to discover, despite the kind of swamping out of the genetic gene pool of these hunting-gathering groups, trying to go behind the layer of Bantu-speaking genes that have come more recently. To do that, I've gone to looking at autosomes that are also informative, but not as informative as the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA. But we take what information we can get. One thing that I have worked on for a number of years is developing systems on the autosomes, chromosomes 1 to 22, that I call SNPsters, where we have a linked SNP and an STR. I defined those earlier, and what we do is look for pairs of those. And I grabbed this actually off a website. There's a group in England who have actually set up a website based on this innovation that I put forth, published in 2002, and they have discovered hundreds of thousands of these systems by scanning genome databases, not just for humans but for other species. And so they actually define it here, and I'm not going to worry too much about the words, but what we have is a SNP, as I defined earlier, plus a short tag and repeat linked to one another. This is a slowly evolving system. This is a rapidly mutating system, and we take advantage of the difference in the mutation rates. And so they've been very successful in just discovering lots of these systems. We've discovered a subset of but I was excited to see that someone else is taking off with this kind of work. I've actually been very interested in how much information about human history is in these genetic systems, and so I have proposed that a particular ratio, and this is, I'm not going to spend enough time to really give you a good sense of what this ratio is, but it's the ratio of the STR variants, and I haven't defined for you. A UEP is a unique event polymorphism. Unique is something that happens rarely. So SNP is a UEP, a deletion is a UEP. But I'm looking at the variants, the STR variants, compared to the frequency of a particular allele, and that comparison or ratio tells us something about recent migration. So that ratio is called J here, and if you have depending on the number of generations of recent migration, that ratio goes way up high. If you've had a few generations of recent migration, that ratio will be very high. And I'm not going to, so a high ratio suggests that you've got this kind of situation, and it doesn't have to be unidirectional, but in our case it probably is, where we've got Bantu-speaking people who arrived around 3,000 years ago, and what we do is then use the J ratio to estimate the amount of migration from the agriculturalists into the hunter-gatherer populations. And at the same time, we ask, well, how long ago did these populations diverge from one another? How isolated have they been? And we've used software generated by one of my graduate students called Rejector. And this is very simple. You don't even have to look at this flow chart. What we do is we imagine a population history, we simulate it in a computer, and we simulate the DNA that would happen, that would come out with that population history. And then we ask, well, what are the characteristics of those data compared to our observed data? And we keep doing this. It's very computer intensive. But we keep doing it until we find a set of population histories that gives us the same kind of data that we observe. So it's crude, but it seems to work. It's one way of discovering what set of population histories is consistent with your observed data. So that's the kind of method we use to estimate time of population divergence. So this allows us to kind of go back behind the recent migration of the Bantu speakers and to think about a question that was put forth by another population geneticist, Dr. Joanna, who suggested that prior to this big wave of migration of Bantu speakers, hunter-gatherers were very much in contact with one another, that they were always interacting, and that only with the arrival of the red, the foragers, as they're called here, I believe, did you suddenly start to see isolation of the hunting-gathering groups, so that the isolation is something very recent and was caused by the arrival of the agriculturalists. So our data strongly contradict this model and suggest that no, these groups were isolated well before the arrival of the Bantu speakers. Probably because they were small and because it's a very large continent and because people adapted culturally to those diverse environments that I exemplified early on in the talk. So that in reality, you had, even though these groups might have been somewhat close to each other, and in this case I imagine that they were click-speaking populations, but they seem to have been quite far apart, that the Bantu speakers coming from Western Africa arrived and then actually started interacting with each of those populations. And so that's more what we think happened than than the Bantu speakers actually doing the division or leading to the subdivision of the hunter-gathering groups. So our view, given our data analysis so far, is that there were, during the dry periods, especially 25,000 to 10,000 years ago, the ancestors of living peoples in Africa ended up retreating to hospitable areas, not just in Eastern Africa, but also in Central, maybe even Western Africa and Southern Africa. There's enough subdivision in the hunting-gathering populations that, and especially if we can go behind looking at the impact of the Bantu speakers, that we have a model here of quite a bit of isolation between the groups, and then only recently do we have this migration between across the groups that is mediated by this expansion of agriculturalists who are looking for new areas to cultivate and so on, and taking their livestock to new areas. So this is just a quick summary. If we look at migration in Africa over the last 60,000 years, we imagine that quite early on you had people moving probably from Eastern Africa out to the west, down to the south. I should explain that I indicate populations are indicated on a circle, because if you have a circle you can represent all possible connections. Otherwise it's tricky. So the circle doesn't map quite onto the map of Africa, but this is Northern Africa, Northeastern, Eastern, Southeastern, and so on, Central, Western. And so here, and we also know that around that time we have movement out of Africa. So usually that's the big story. People are asking about this. I've been focusing on what's happening within the continent. So during this drier period, I suspect that there probably was connections between people up and down the eastern region of Africa, but that you have occupied areas, Western, Central, and Southern Africa, occupied by different peoples during that time, that there was persistent. People survived in those other regions, even during the driest periods. When we get a bit more recent, it looks like Northern Africa, the peoples living there now can trace their ancestry back to contributions from both Western and Eastern Africa. More recently, there have been interactions with peoples outside of Africa and North Africa, but not too much in recent time. Less, the Sahara has been a bit of a barrier, but now we've seen, this is showing the migration of Bantu speakers plus a little bit of additional migration in Eastern Africa in recent times. So a lot more migration in recent times than we had in the past. So that's the summary we have. And so one conclusion we reach is that the current linguistic and cultural diversity of the Hadza, and sometimes they also call themselves the Hadzabe, is consistent with long-term isolation, at least 5,000 years, but maybe 10,000 years. This is kind of hard to imagine. How do groups on one continent remain isolated from one another for thousands of years? But that's what the genetic data are telling us. And it could be because they were small, they were struggling, and there are even some small populations now. And that this is prior to the arrival of agriculturalists and pastoralists within the last few thousand years that ended up basically generating genetic connections between everybody on the continent. So I focus mostly on the groups of Tanzania. We have considered groups from Southern Africa, but this year, last year in the fall, 2 of my graduate students went to South Africa to look at, to visit, and I had already met with these peoples, the representatives of a Khoisan speaking group, some of whom speak the Mu language. It's very hard for me to say, but there are only 8 speakers living of this language. And so I worked with a linguist who actually discovered that there were any speakers left. And Nigel Crawhall has been very helpful, also because he understands the ethnicity of South Africa, which is a fascinating comparison to this country. What happened was during the apartheid period, all indigenous languages were basically suppressed, and people basically stopped speaking whatever language they were speaking and started speaking Afrikaans. And so it wasn't. It was believed that there were no speakers of these old click languages anymore. But Nigel Crawhall went and knocked on doors and said, I've heard that there might have been somebody, your grandmother, who might speak this. And he said one time he went to the door and a young woman said, "My mother is not a Bushman." and the mother came and said, "Actually, I do speak that language." So it had been basically suppressed. And so it's been fascinating to discover that there are a few speakers left. So my students went to this part of South Africa up here, and the new speakers used to live in a fairly broad area, and collected samples from a few of the people living there. These are my students, and this is Magdalena Kasi, who helped collect saliva samples. And this is Uma Uta, who is one of these are 2 of the last speakers. They're all older. There were 9 last year, and there are only 8 this year because one of them passed away. They're trying to teach some of the kids the language. So I can't stop there, even though I have no more slides, because last week we started getting the first Y chromosome data from these people, which is very exciting. We have not a big sample, but about 40 individuals for whom we have Y chromosome data, and they look again quite distinct genetically from the other Southern African click speakers for whom we have data. So in Tanzania, remember, we had 2 click speaking groups, and they were genetically quite different. Didn't dwell on that too much, and we thought, aha. We've seen deep subdivision even within this one language family in Tanzania, but now we're seeing it again in Southern Africa. So despite everyone lumping all these people together, and they don't want to be lumped together, that's probably fairly common throughout the world. People don't want to be called the same thing as neighbors who speak a different language, but we're finding that again, the people who speak this language have quite different lineages, and something that we don't see anywhere else in the world, this deep subdivision along linguistic lines, but even within this linguistic family. So it's exciting to be getting new data for this part of the world, and we're still waiting to do the mitochondrial DNA for those individuals. So there are many, many people to thank in South Africa. This is a colleague from India. Colleagues at the University of Maryland who worked on the mitochondrial DNA, colleagues at Stanford, students, undergraduates and graduates, and so on. Very many people are involved, and certainly the hundreds of sample donors who've made this work possible. Thank you very much. I'm hoping to leave time. I know some people have to rush off. I'm happy to take questions as people are exiting.
Can someone turn on the light? Man, can you? Thanks.
Yes, Gretchen.
So I'm really fascinated that the Cook language didn't move out of Africa, or that there's only those isolated cases.
Yes.
Is it thought that that has something to do with these people primarily being hunter-gatherers? So
well, obviously, hunter-gatherers, we're all descendants of hunter-gatherers, 10,000 years ago. Right? So it's a great question. Why would this be? My guess is that the channels to move north were through eastern Africa for the most part, and that there were there developed people. So the radical statement, the kind of functional statement that we get criticized for all the time, is that as soon as people left the savanna areas, if they went through the forests, the cliques were no longer as valuable. Now, so this is a very hypothetical scenario, but some people have proposed, including my co-author, that who hunts. Okay, I don't do any hunting. That that the clicking, when people have been able to communicate by clicking with one another while they're hunting, and it doesn't spook the animals, because the clicking sounds a lot like other sounds in the savanna, dry twigs. In fact, there's a, if any of you have read Alexander McCall Smith's series, at one point he talks about the language of the Khoisan as like the crackling of dry twigs. I mean, I don't think he has been following the genetics literature, but so it was a coincidence. But so there's a suggestion that as people moved out of the savanna areas, there was no longer any benefit to having this component to the languages, especially in forested regions where the soundscape is radically different. Now, so that's one possibility. Another possibility we see, I think there was continuous occupation of Eastern Africa by humans. And so if the people speaking Click languages are south of there, they have to get through that probably relatively large population, more dense than the rest of Africa. And that there seems to have been a barrier. And Tanzania seems to be right there where there's probably high density for most of the history. And so I think there may have been a population barrier in that there were linguistic differences by 20,000 years ago. These language families had already formed. And so I'm speculating here, but there obviously, there was a reason they haven't left. And yet there's diversity within this language channel.
Can I just follow up by asking, for the other sites that are in Asia, right? You said there are a couple of small populations.
Oh,
that have
with clicks?
Yeah.
There's one recorded case of a language called Danin in Australia, which is a ritualized language among males that no longer is spoken. So it's just one example, and it's not very well understood.
Then I want to ask a question.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
So I was just interested in when you get the saliva samples.
Yes.
I know that in this country, oftentimes when genetic studies are done on populations of color, that there's distrust and a lot of that sort of thing. And so is that the case in Africa?
There, not nearly so much. There's not distrust at the local level that people you're working, well, there is, but it varies. So I had people refuse. I had in Tanzania, I had about 30% refusal, maybe higher. People who didn't trust what we were doing. But you work hard to build up trust. So I went and visited in South Africa the same people a year before the sampling, met with everybody, met with local leaders, met with possible subjects, and laid the groundwork. And then my students went back. One of them had been with me the year before, so they knew us, they knew what we were doing. Time helps build up trust. And then we went through the channels of the legal representative of that one particular group, And some people are excited. They actually have heard of the National Geographic Project, so they know. And South Africa has been in the news because Nelson Mandela traces his maternal ancestry back to a so-called bush woman, I guess, a click-speaking person. And you know, Oprah was thinking she was related to a Zulu for a while. That didn't make any sense genetically, and it turned out to be a mistake. But anyway, so there actually are people who are aware of this and think it's actually interesting, not to be feared. Now, one of the issues that comes up is, do we return the genetic data to people? And I am reluctant to do that without being there to kind of do some counseling. What does it mean if you have a lineage that isn't quintessentially click speaking, or you thought you were affiliated with one group, and yet your DNA for one lineage, like maternal or paternal, looks like it's from Bantu speakers, which is very likely. It's like African Americans in this country. Many men who get typed find that their Y chromosomes trace to Europe. It can be disconcerting. So I feel like if I am to give the data to people. And my colleague in South Africa is very adamant that she will return the data, but she's in South Africa, she can more readily deal with it. I need funding for people who are going to do some counseling there, or teaching, education. And our grants haven't covered that. It's hard enough to make multiple trips without having to go back and counsel everybody about the information. So we have said we're not returning it because we're not a genetic counseling team. But I have not found the resistance or the concern amongst peoples who might participate. Sometimes amongst leaders there is, and it took 2 years in Tanzania to get permission. The medical researchers were confused, like, why would you, this doesn't sound very medical, but we had to go through them because we were using bodily fluids. The science people thought, well, we don't trust this because it's bodily fluids. So it was tough. So it's more at the higher levels. Australia's very different. People have been rallied to fight against this. There are groups in other parts. And this country's quite resistant, even to the Genographic Project, where thousands of people are submitting their samples. But American Indians have been very wary of it. And I think that makes sense. I mean, there has to be a level of trust. And there have been plenty of reasons not to trust. Even very recent examples, they have super where the DNA was collected and it was promised to be used for one type of research and was used for another type, and that you just breach the trust right there. So it's a great set of issues. Yeah. Yes.
So your simulation models are simulating different population histories,
yes,
different population sizes.
Yeah. We can vary sizes, no selections, and all neutral. Because we're trying to use the power of multiple regions. And so it depends on what kind of markers we're using. I have one student who's working on sequence data. Those are also informative. But the sequence data are for gene regions. And we were using this MC1R gene region, which influences hair color, and is known to have undergone selection in people of European ancestry. So really, the story of that gene is not about human history, it's about advantageous mutations. So we eliminated that remark, but then we end up with no data. So we tend to use SNPs and STRs, these data where you can get many independent data points.
So is most of the discrimination in allele frequencies?
I like to have haplotypes. Y chromosome, mitochondria, or these SNPsters where you've got linked markers. That's where you get power. Frequencies will only tell you how different people are. They don't tell you if that differentiation comes from being isolated in the past and then linked in the recent past. You just don't get the detail. Oh, and I forgot to mention that recently, Alex Schuster, who's here from the math department, and I started talking about going beyond simulation to actually getting expectations for the statistic I mentioned, this ratio, variances that allow us to really get the power of the statistic for making inferences about human history. So that's very exciting to have somebody who can give us strength in that area.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.